Marcus stood in the doorway of their penthouse, unaware his wife had secretly inherited a billion-dollar fortune from her late grandfather just 3 days prior. With cold indifference, he threw her and her newborn daughter out into the snow on that bitter December night, eager to marry her best friend Vanessa, who had been whispering poison in his ear for months. As Sarah clutched her crying baby and stumbled through the freezing streets with nowhere to go, Marcus smiled, thinking he'd finally freed himself from the burden of a poor, worthless wife. But what happened next shocked him to his core. Within 72 hours, he discovered that the homeless woman he discarded owned the very building he lived in, controlled the company he worked for, and held the power to destroy everything he'd ever wanted, including his future with the woman who had orchestrated his betrayal. The baby's cries echoed through the marble-floored penthouse as Eleanor Morrison clutched her 3-week-old daughter closer to her chest, her body still aching from the emergency cesarean that had nearly taken both their lives. The winter wind howled outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, rattling the glass like skeletal fingers demanding entry. She could see her reflection in that glass, pale and trembling, her dark hair matted with sweat despite the cold that seemed to emanate from her husband's eyes. Those eyes, once warm and full of promises whispered in college dormitories and sealed with cheap wine, now held nothing but contempt. Blake Richardson stood before her with his arms crossed, his jaw set in that familiar way that meant his decision was final, and no amount of pleading would change it. Behind him, draped across the leather sofa like a cat who'd caught the canary, sat Jessica Harper, Eleanor's former best friend since freshman year at Columbia, her manicured nails drumming against the armrest in barely concealed triumph. Eleanor's mind raced back to 3 days ago, to the lawyer's office on Fifth Avenue, where she'd sat in disbelief as Martin Pemberton, her late grandfather's attorney, had explained that the eccentric old man she'd barely known had left her everything. Everything. The real estate empire spanning 12 states, the investment portfolio worth more than some country's GDP, the controlling shares in dozens of corporations including Richardson Technologies, where Blake worked as a mid-level project manager. Her grandfather had been estranged from her mother for decades, a rift Eleanor never understood, and she'd only met him twice in her entire life. The last time was at her mother's funeral 5 years ago, where he'd stood apart from the other mourners, watching her with those sharp blue eyes that seemed to calculate and measure everything they saw. He'd approached her afterward, pressed a business card into her hand, and told her in a gravelly voice that she had her grandmother's spirit. Then he was gone, and she'd thrown the card away, too consumed by grief to care about cryptic comments from a stranger who happened to share her blood. But Pemberton had found her anyway. The inheritance came with conditions, he'd explained, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he regarded her across the mahogany desk. She had to keep it secret for 30 days, a test her grandfather had insisted upon, something about seeing who truly valued her for herself. The money would be held in trust, managed by Pemberton's firm, while she observed and documented her life as it currently existed. Only after the 30 days could she claim her fortune and reveal the truth. It had seemed like madness, like something out of a novel, but Pemberton had shown her the documents, the bank statements, the property deeds, all bearing her name. She'd signed in a daze, her pregnant belly pressing against the edge of the desk. While Pemberton warned her that her grandfather had been a shrewd judge of character, and this test had a purpose she would understand in time. She understood now as Blake's voice cut through her memories like a blade through silk. "I want you out tonight. Pack whatever you can carry. The rest stays here." His voice was flat, emotionless, as if he were discussing a business transaction rather than dissolving a marriage of 6 years. Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The baby, little Rosemary, named after Eleanor's mother, wailed louder as if sensing her mother's distress. "Blake, please, it's snowing. The doctors said I need to rest. Rosemary needs warmth and stability. I had major surgery 3 weeks ago. I'm still bleeding. I can barely walk." Her voice cracked on the last word. Desperation bleeding through despite her efforts to remain calm. She'd learned early in their marriage that emotion only made Blake more resolute, more convinced that she was being irrational and hysterical. Jessica rose from the sofa, her crimson dress clinging to her curves as she glided across the room to stand beside Blake. She placed a possessive hand on his arm, her diamond bracelet, a gift Eleanor remembered admiring just months ago catching the light. Stop being so dramatic, Elle. You always do this. You make everything about you. Jessica's voice dripped with false concern, the kind that twisted the knife while pretending to offer comfort. Blake and I have been in love for over a year now. We tried to spare your feelings, waited until after the baby came, but we can't keep living a lie. You're suffocating him with your neediness, your constant demands for attention. He deserves happiness, and so do I. The words struck Eleanor like physical blows. A year. They'd been betraying her for a year. Through her pregnancy, through the complications that had landed her on bed rest for 3 months, through the terrifying night when her blood pressure had spiked and the doctors had performed an emergency cesarean to save her life and Rosemary's. She thought back to all those late nights when Blake claimed he was working, all those weekends when Jessica had suddenly been too busy to meet for coffee, canceling their weekly brunches with increasingly flimsy excuses. The signs had been there, scattered like breadcrumbs through her memory, but she'd been too trusting, too exhausted, too focused on bringing a healthy baby into the world to see the betrayal blooming right in front of her face. Blake's expression hardened further, if that was possible. Jessica's right. You've always been clingy, always demanding more than I could give. I married you because you seemed different from other girls, sweet and uncomplicated, but you turned into this needy, exhausting burden. I work 60 hours a week trying to climb the corporate ladder, and what do I come home to? Complaints about being tired, about needing help, about feeling alone. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Jessica understands. She's ambitious, driven, successful in her own right. She's a partner, not a dependent. He gestured toward the bedroom. You have 20 minutes. I've already called security to escort you out if you're not gone by then. Eleanor's legs threatened to give out beneath her. She sank onto the ottoman, clutching Rosemary against her chest as the baby's cries finally subsided into hiccuping whimpers. This couldn't be happening. She'd given Blake everything, supported his career moves, sacrificed her own dreams of becoming an architect to play the dutiful corporate wife, hosting dinner parties for his colleagues, smiling through tedious company events, making their home a sanctuary he could retreat to after long days. She'd loved him with every fiber of her being, believed in the future they were building together, and now he was throwing her away like garbage, discarding her in the cruelest way possible. On a night when the temperature had dropped below zero, and the snow was falling so heavily that the city had issued warnings for people to stay indoors. She looked up at Jessica, searching for some remnant of the friend who'd been her maid of honor, who'd held her hair back during morning sickness, who'd promised to be Rosemary's godmother. But Jessica's green eyes held only cold satisfaction, a predator's gaze fixed on prey that had finally been cornered. How long have you been planning this? Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jessica smiled, and it was the smile of a stranger wearing a familiar face. Since Blake and I reconnected at the Richardson Technologies Gala last year. Remember? You were too pregnant to attend, so I went as Blake's +1. We got to talking, really talking, and we realized we had so much in common. The chemistry was instant, undeniable. We tried to fight it, Elle. We really did. But some things are just meant to be. Blake deserves someone who can match his ambition, someone who doesn't drag him down with constant emotional needs. The cruelty of it took Eleanor's breath away. She remembered that night, remembered how sick she'd been, vomiting every hour, her body rejecting everything she tried to eat. She'd insisted Blake go to the gala anyway, because it was important for his career, because she loved him and wanted him to succeed. She'd texted Jessica that morning, asking her to keep an eye on Blake, make sure he networked with the right people, had a good time. She'd practically handed her husband to her best friend on a silver platter. Eleanor forced herself to stand, her surgical incisions screaming in protest. I need to call someone. I need to find a place to go. Blake shook his head. Your phone is in my name. The plan's been canceled. I've already changed all the passwords to our accounts. You have nothing, Eleanor. You came into this marriage with nothing, and you're leaving with nothing. That's what happens when you don't contribute, when you're just a parasite feeding off someone else's success. The words were designed to destroy, and they accomplished their purpose. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, hot against her cold cheeks. She hadn't worked during their marriage because Blake had insisted on it, said he wanted a wife who could focus on making their home perfect, who would be available whenever he needed her. She'd given up her scholarship to the architecture program at MIT, given up her dreams of designing buildings that would stand for centuries, all because Blake had convinced her that being his wife was a greater purpose. She stumbled toward the bedroom. Rosemary clutched against her chest and began throwing clothes into a diaper bag with shaking hands. Baby blankets, diapers, formula, the essentials for Rosemary's survival. For herself, she grabbed a coat, a few sweaters, jeans that no longer fit her post-pregnancy body. Everything felt surreal, like she was watching herself from a great distance, seeing this tragedy unfold but powerless to stop it. Through the open bedroom door, she could hear Jessica's laugh, high and tinkling, followed by the sound of Blake's voice murmuring something she couldn't make out. The intimacy in their tones made her stomach turn. 20 minutes passed like 20 seconds. Eleanor found herself standing in the hallway outside the penthouse, the door slamming shut behind her with a finality that echoed through her bones. The security guard who'd escorted her out looked uncomfortable, avoiding her eyes as he returned to his post. The elevator descended, and with each floor that passed, Eleanor felt her old life falling away, shattering into pieces she could never reassemble. The lobby was empty except for the night doorman, who looked startled to see her emerging into the winter night with nothing but a diaper bag and a baby. "Mrs. Richardson, is everything all right?" His concern was genuine, but Eleanor couldn't speak. If she opened her mouth, she would scream, and if she started screaming, she might never stop. The snow hit her face like tiny knives as she stepped out onto the sidewalk. The wind had picked up, turning the gentle snowfall into a near whiteout. Eleanor pulled Rosemary's blanket over her tiny face, shielding her from the storm, and began walking with no destination in mind. Just moving because stopping meant confronting the full horror of what had just happened, and she wasn't ready for that yet. Her feet left tracks in the fresh snow, tracks that filled in behind her almost immediately, racing evidence of her passage as if she'd never existed at all. The city that had once felt like home now loomed around her like a hostile stranger, its buildings dark and indifferent, its streets empty of any salvation. Eleanor's mind kept returning to the lawyer's office, to the documents she'd signed, to the fortune that was legally hers but practically inaccessible for another 27 days. 27 days might as well be 27 years when you were homeless with a newborn in a blizzard. She couldn't call Pemberton, couldn't break the terms of her grandfather's test. Not yet. Something in her, some stubborn core of pride or curiosity, wanted to see this through, wanted to understand what her grandfather had known about people, about Blake, about Jessica, that had prompted such an unusual condition. She would survive these 27 days, she decided, as her feet carried her through the snow. She would survive, and then she would show them all exactly who Eleanor Morrison really was. Behind her, in the penthouse she'd once called home, Blake Richardson poured champagne for himself and Jessica Harper, toasting to their future together, completely unaware that he just made the worst mistake of his life. The subway station's fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting sickly shadows across the cracked tile walls as Eleanor descended the stairs, her legs trembling with each step. The warmth hit her like a physical force after the brutal cold above, and Rosemary stirred in her arms, making small mewing sounds that broke Eleanor's heart into ever smaller pieces. A few scattered passengers occupied the platform, hunched figures absorbed in their phones or their own private miseries, none of them looking up as she passed. Eleanor found a bench at the far end of the platform, near a vending machine that hummed ominously, and sank down onto the cold plastic seat. Her surgical incision throbbed with a deep, nauseating pain that radiated through her entire abdomen. She knew she should be in bed, should be healing, should be somewhere warm and safe with proper medical care. Instead, she was in a subway station at midnight with nowhere to go and a baby depending on her for survival. She unwrapped Rosemary carefully, checking to make sure the cold hadn't hurt her. The baby's skin was still warm, her tiny fingers curling and uncurling as she slept, her rosebud mouth making sucking motions. Eleanor felt a fierce surge of love so powerful it almost stopped her breath. Whatever happened to her, she would protect this child. She would find a way to survive until she could claim her inheritance. And then she would build a life for them both that no one could ever take away. But first, she needed to make it through the night. Her phone was dead, cut off as Blake had promised, a useless rectangle of glass and metal in her coat pocket. She had $17 in her wallet, money she'd been saving from the small household allowance Blake gave her each week, money she'd been setting aside for a surprise anniversary dinner she'd been planning. The irony was almost funny. Almost. A memory surfaced, sharp and vivid, from 8 years ago when she'd first met Blake at a coffee shop near campus. She'd been studying for her structural engineering final, surrounded by textbooks and sketches of building designs, her hair piled on top of her head in a messy bun, wearing her oldest jeans and a sweater with a hole in the elbow. He'd approached her table with that confident smile, asked if he could sit down, and somehow they'd ended up talking for 4 hours straight. The exam forgotten, the world narrowing to just the two of them. He'd seemed genuinely interested in her dreams, her passion for creating spaces that people could live and work in, buildings that would stand as testaments to human creativity and ambition. He'd told her about his own goals, his determination to rise through the corporate ranks, to make a name for himself in the tech world. They'd seemed like perfect complements, two ambitious people who could support each other's dreams while building something beautiful together. When had it changed? Eleanor tried to pinpoint the exact moment when Blake's support had turned to resentment, when his encouragement had morphed into subtle sabotage. Maybe it was when she'd gotten accepted to MIT's graduate program with a full scholarship, and he'd proposed instead, telling her that marriage was more important than a degree, that they could always pursue her dreams later once they were settled. She'd said yes because she loved him, because she believed him when he said they were a team. Or maybe it was after the wedding when he'd started making comments about her appearance, suggesting she dress more professionally for his company events, criticizing her wardrobe as too casual, too young, not sophisticated enough. She'd changed her style to please him, buying expensive clothes they couldn't afford, styling her hair the way he preferred, becoming a polished version of herself that felt like wearing a costume. Or perhaps it was when she'd brought up going back to school, using some of their savings to at least take a few online classes, and he'd exploded, accusing her of being selfish, of not appreciating the comfortable life he provided, of wanting to waste their money on frivolous pursuits. That fight had lasted 3 days, ending only when she'd apologized and promised to focus on being a better wife. She'd thrown herself into the role with desperate enthusiasm, cooking elaborate meals, keeping their apartment immaculate, organizing his schedule, doing everything she could think of to prove her worth. But it was never enough. His criticisms had only multiplied, growing sharper and more cutting, until she began to believe what he was saying, that she was inadequate, that she was lucky he'd married her at all, that no one else would want her. A train screeched into the station, its doors opening to disgorge a handful of late-night travelers. Eleanor watched them disperse, envying their ability to simply go home, to have homes to go to. She thought about boarding the train, riding it to the end of the line just to stay warm, but she had no idea where she'd end up or if there would be another train to bring her back. Better to stay here in this familiar station, where at least she knew where she was. A police officer walked past, his eyes sliding over her without interest. She wasn't causing trouble, wasn't breaking any laws by sitting on a bench with a baby. Not yet, but she knew that would change if she tried to stay here all night. There were rules about loitering, about using public spaces as shelter. She'd read articles about it, never imagining she'd be on the other side of that equation, one of the invisible people the city tried to sweep out of sight. Jessica's face floated through her mind, twisted in that cruel smile. They'd met during freshman orientation, both assigned to the same dorm, both far from home and terrified of the huge university and the competitive student body. They'd bonded over late-night study sessions and cheap pizza, shared their deepest secrets and biggest fears. Jessica had been there when Eleanor's mother died, had held her through the grief and helped her get through that awful semester. Eleanor had been there when Jessica's first serious boyfriend cheated on her, had helped her move out of his apartment, had sworn they'd never let men come between them. So many promises, so many years of friendship, and it had all been a lie, or at least it had become one. Eleanor wondered if Jessica had ever truly cared about her, or if she'd just been biding her time, waiting for an opportunity to take something Eleanor had that she wanted. The betrayal hurt almost more than Blake's rejection. She'd expected husbands and wives to sometimes fall out of love, had known that divorce was always a possibility, even in the happiest marriages. But best friends were supposed to be forever. Were supposed to be the ones you turned to when romantic relationships failed. Jessica had systematically destroyed both of Eleanor's most important relationships in one blow. And she'd done it with a smile, done it without remorse or hesitation. That level of calculated cruelty suggested something deeply wrong with Jessica, something Eleanor had never seen or had chosen not to see. Had there been signs? Had Jessica always been capable of this kind of betrayal, and Eleanor had just been too naive to notice? Rosemary began to cry, the soft whimpering escalating to full-throated wails that echoed through the station. Eleanor fumbled for a bottle, using the last of the lukewarm formula she'd prepared before leaving the penthouse. The baby latched on desperately, her tiny hands clutching at Eleanor's fingers as she drank. Eleanor watched her daughter's face, so innocent, so completely dependent, and felt the weight of responsibility settle over her like a physical force. This baby hadn't asked to be born into this situation, hadn't done anything to deserve a father who would throw her out into the snow without a second thought. Blake had held Rosemary in the hospital, had gazed down at her with what Eleanor had believed was love, had promised to protect her always. All lies, all performance. He'd already been planning to leave, had probably been discussing the timeline with Jessica while Eleanor lay in the hospital bed recovering from surgery. The formula ran out too quickly, and Rosemary's cries resumed, this time tinged with the desperate edge of genuine hunger. Eleanor had only brought 4 bottles, thinking she'd be able to make more wherever they ended up. Now she realized the depth of her miscalculation. She had no way to prepare more formula, no access to clean water or a way to heat it. The $17 in her wallet would buy formula powder, but not the equipment to prepare it properly. She'd need bottles, water, a way to measure and mix, facilities that were completely unavailable to someone living on the streets. Panic began to claw at her throat. Rosemary needed to eat every 2 to 3 hours. Without proper nutrition, a newborn could deteriorate rapidly, could develop serious health problems or worse. Eleanor had read all the baby books, had memorized all the warnings and guidelines. She knew exactly how precarious her daughter's situation was. A woman in a business suit hurried past, her heels clicking on the tile, her eyes deliberately averted from Eleanor and the crying baby. Eleanor almost called out to her, almost begged for help, but pride held her tongue. What would she even say? That her husband had thrown her out? That she had a billion-dollar fortune she couldn't access? It sounded insane even to her own ears. No one would believe her. They'd think she was mentally ill, might call child services, might take Rosemary away. That fear, more than any other, kept Eleanor silent. She would figure this out herself. She had to. She thought of her grandfather, the man who'd engineered this test. What had he wanted her to learn? What was the point of forcing her to endure this when he could have simply left her the money with no conditions? Unless the conditions were the point. Unless he'd wanted her to see exactly who the people in her life really were when there was nothing to gain from her, when she was at her most vulnerable. If that was his purpose, he'd succeeded brilliantly. In one night, Eleanor had learned that her husband had never truly loved her, that her best friend had been a snake waiting to strike, that the life she'd built was nothing but a facade that could crumble at the first sign of adversity. She'd learned that she was stronger than she'd believed, but also more alone than she'd ever imagined possible. The grandfather she'd barely known had been right about one thing. This test had shown her the truth, brutal and undeniable. Now she just had to survive long enough to use that knowledge. She pulled Rosemary closer, rocking her gently as the baby's cries finally subsided into exhausted sleep. 27 more days. She could do this for 27 more days. She had to. The shelter's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Eleanor stood in the intake line, Rosemary mercifully asleep against her shoulder. She'd spent the rest of the night in the subway station, catching fragments of sleep between trains, waking every time someone walked past or Rosemary stirred. At dawn, she'd asked a fellow passenger for directions to the nearest women's shelter, had walked the 12 blocks through streets beginning to fill with morning commuters, all of them hurrying past her as if homelessness might be contagious. The shelter was a converted warehouse in a neighborhood Eleanor had never visited, its brick walls covered in graffiti and its windows protected by metal bars. A handwritten sign on the door read, "No vacancy," but someone had crossed it out and written, "Emergency intake, 7-9 a.m. only," beneath it in red marker. Eleanor had arrived at 6:45, joining a line of women and children who all wore the same expression of desperate resignation. The woman ahead of her in line was probably in her 50s, though hardship had aged her, carving deep lines around her mouth and eyes. She turned to Eleanor with a knowing look. "First time?" Her voice was rough, scraped raw by cigarettes or screaming or both. Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The woman's expression softened. "You got that look. Still shocked that you ended up here. That'll fade. Give it a week." She gestured toward Rosemary. "How old?" Eleanor found her voice. 3 weeks." The woman whistled low. "Jesus, that's young. What happened?" Eleanor hesitated, then found herself spilling the whole story, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. The eviction, Blake, Jessica, the snow, the subway station. The woman listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each detail. When Eleanor finished, the woman was quiet for a long moment. "Your husband, he got a name?" Eleanor told her. The woman's eyes narrowed. "Richardson Technologies. That's the big software company, right? The one with the headquarters downtown?" Eleanor nodded. "I used to work there. Data entry before they automated my department and laid us all off. No severance, no warning, just a pink slip and security escorting us out. That was 3 years ago. Haven't found steady work since. These tech companies, they talk about innovation and progress, but they don't care who they destroy along the way." She spat on the ground. "Your husband's one of them. Probably never occurred to him that his decisions affect real people with real lives. Men like that, they think the world exists to serve them, and anyone who can't keep up deserves whatever they get." The line moved forward slowly, and Eleanor watched the intake process with growing dread. Each woman was interviewed by a tired-looking social worker who asked probing questions about their circumstances, their history, their reasons for needing shelter. Some women were turned away, told the shelter was full, given a list of other facilities they could try. Eleanor saw one young woman break down crying when she was rejected, saw the social worker's face remain impassive, unmoved by tears or pleas. The shelter had rules, the social worker explained in a voice that suggested she'd given this speech 1,000 times. No drugs, no alcohol, no violence. Random checks at any time. Lights out at 10. Everyone out by 7 a.m. for day programs or job searches. No exceptions. 2-week maximum stay unless the special circumstances applied. Eleanor filed away all the information, her mind working through the logistics of surviving in this system. When her turn came, Eleanor faced a different social worker, a black woman in her 30s whose name tag read Diana Thornton. Diana's eyes were kind but assessing, taking in Eleanor's expensive coat, her wedding ring, the designer diaper bag. "Tell me what happened," Diana said, and Eleanor repeated her story for the second time that morning. Diana listened carefully, making notes on a battered clipboard. When Eleanor finished, Diana set down her pen and leaned forward. "I'm going to be straight with you. We're at 110% capacity. We've got women sleeping on the floor in the common room. But you've got a newborn, and that gives you priority. I can get you a bed in the family wing, but it's going to be cramped. And you'll be sharing a room with 3 other mothers and their kids. Is that acceptable?" Eleanor wanted to laugh at the question. Acceptable. As if she had choices, as if she could afford to be picky. "Yes, thank you," Diana nodded. "Okay. I need some information from you for our records." "Full legal name." Eleanor provided it, along with her social security number, her date of birth, all the bureaucratic details that would file her away in the system. Diana's eyebrows rose when she entered Eleanor's name into the computer. Interesting. According to this, you're still listed at an address in the Upper East Side. That's a pretty expensive neighborhood. You want to tell me what's really going on here? Because women from that zip code don't usually end up in our shelter. Eleanor felt her face flush. I told you, my husband threw me out. The apartment is in his name. I have nothing. Diana studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor could see the calculations happening behind her eyes, the questions about whether Eleanor was telling the truth or running some kind of scam. Finally, Diana sighed. I believe you. I've seen this before. More often than you'd think. Rich husband, wife with no independent income, relationship goes south, and suddenly she's got nothing. The system's designed to keep women dependent and vulnerable. But here's the thing. You seem educated. You're well-spoken. You've got resources, even if you can't access them right now. There are women in this shelter who've been homeless for years, who've got nothing and nobody. They need these beds desperately. So I'm going to give you 2 weeks, and in those 2 weeks, I want you to figure out a plan. Call family, call friends, call a lawyer if you need to, but don't plan on staying here long term. We're not a permanent solution. We're a bridge. Understood? Eleanor nodded, feeling both grateful and ashamed. Diana was right. She did have resources, would have access to unimaginable wealth in 27 days. But right now, in this moment, she was as homeless and desperate as any woman in the shelter, and her newborn daughter was depending on her to find a way through this nightmare. Diana handed her a key attached to a plastic wristband. Room 217. You'll get 3 meals a day in the cafeteria, and we've got a supply room with diapers, formula, baby clothes, whatever you need. There's a case manager who'll meet with you tomorrow to go over resources and next steps. For now, get some rest. You look like you're about to collapse. Eleanor took the key with shaking hands, feeling tears prick her eyes at this small kindness. Thank you. You have no idea what this means? Diana's expression softened. I do, actually. I was where you are once, about 15 years ago. Different circumstances, but the same feeling of having your whole world pulled out from under you. I got through it. You will too. Just remember that this isn't permanent. This is a chapter, not the whole story. Eleanor carried those words with her as she climbed the stairs to the second floor, past paint-peeled walls covered with inspirational posters that felt simultaneously encouraging and patronizing. Room 217 was at the end of a long hallway that smelled of industrial cleaner and desperation. She unlocked the door and stepped inside to find exactly what Diana had described. 4 beds crammed into a space designed for 2, with barely room to walk between them. 3 of the beds were occupied, their owners absent, but personal belongings scattered across thin blankets told Eleanor about her roommates before she met them. 1 bed held children's toys and picture books. Another was meticulously organized, clothing folded with military precision. The 3rd was a chaos of possessions stuffed into garbage bags. Eleanor's bed was by the window, which would have been a blessing, except the window overlooked a brick wall and let in a draft that made the room perpetually cold. She set down the diaper bag and eased herself onto the mattress, which was thin and lumpy, but felt like heaven after the subway station bench. Rosemary stirred, making small fussing sounds, and Eleanor knew she'd wake soon demanding food. The supply room Diana mentioned would have formula, but Eleanor needed to find it. Needed to figure out the shelter's layout and rules, needed to navigate this new world she'd been thrust into. But for just a moment, she let herself simply sit, feeling the exhaustion wash over her in waves. Her body ached in ways she'd never experienced, pain radiating from her surgical site and spreading through her entire torso. She should be in bed with painkillers and proper medical care. Instead, she was in a homeless shelter trying to figure out how to keep her baby alive. A memory surfaced unbidden from the night Blake had proposed. They'd been on a rooftop in Brooklyn, the Manhattan skyline spread before them like a promise of everything their future could hold. He'd gotten down on one knee, presented a ring that must have cost 3 months' salary, and told her that she was his forever, his partner in everything, the one person in the world he couldn't live without. She'd believed every word, had felt like the luckiest woman alive. Looking back now with clear eyes, she could see the manipulation in those words. The way he'd framed their relationship as him bestowing value on her, rather than them creating something together. He'd never asked about her dreams at night, never discussed how they'd support each other's ambitions. It had all been about his vision of their future, his plans, his career, with her playing the role of supportive wife in the background. How had she been so blind? Eleanor had always considered herself intelligent, perceptive, good at reading people. But Blake had systematically dismantled her confidence over the years, had convinced her that her perceptions were wrong, that her feelings were overreactions, that she was too sensitive and needed to trust his judgment over her own. Gaslighting. That was the term for it. She'd read about it in magazines, had watched talk shows discussing emotional abuse, had always thought she'd recognize it if it happened to her. But abuse was insidious, creeping in gradually, normalizing itself until you couldn't remember what healthy looked like anymore. She wondered how many other women in this shelter had similar stories, had loved men who'd systematically destroyed them before throwing them away. Rosemary woke with a cry that shattered Eleanor's reverie. Time to find that supply room. Time to figure out how to navigate this new reality. Eleanor stood, ignoring the protest from her body, and headed back into the hallway. She would do this. She would survive. And in 27 days, she would show Blake Richardson exactly what he'd thrown away. The cafeteria smelled of industrial food and defeat, a combination of overcooked vegetables and the weight of too many hard luck stories contained in too small a space. Eleanor sat at a long table with Rosemary in her arms, picking at a plate of something that might have been meant to be meatloaf, but had the texture and appearance of compressed cardboard. Around her, women talked in low voices, their conversations punctuated by children's laughter and crying. It had been 3 days since Diana had given her a bed. 3 days of learning the shelter's rhythms and unwritten rules. Wake at 6 to avoid the bathroom rush. Eat breakfast by 7, attend mandatory job skills workshop or meet with the case manager. Lunch at noon. Afternoon free time. Though free was relative when you were trapped in a building with 100 other desperate souls. Dinner at 5. Evening programs, parenting classes, addiction support groups, budgeting workshops. Lights out at 10. Repeat. Eleanor's roommates had introduced themselves that first night. Maria was the one with the meticulously organized bed, a former paralegal who'd lost her job during the pandemic and couldn't find work in her field afterward. Her unemployment had run out 6 months ago, and she'd been living in her car before it was repossessed, landing her in the shelter with her 7-year-old son, Diego. She spent every day at the public library, applying for jobs on the computers there, her resume growing more desperate with each iteration as she expanded her search beyond legal work to anything that might pay the bills. Keisha owned the bed with the chaotic garbage bags, a situation Eleanor soon learned was due to the 3 young children she was trying to manage alone. Her ex-husband had been arrested for domestic violence, and rather than press charges, she'd fled with the kids, afraid of retaliation. She had no family, no support system, just her and 3 kids under 5 navigating a system designed to break people rather than build them up. The third roommate, the one whose bed held the toys and books, was a teenager named Brianna, who couldn't have been more than 19. Her daughter Jasmine was 2 years old. A beautiful child with her mother's eyes and a laugh that somehow still held innocence, despite the circumstances. Brianna's story was the hardest to hear. She'd aged out of foster care at 18, had tried to make it on her own, had gotten pregnant by a boyfriend who disappeared the moment he found out. She'd been working 2 minimum wage jobs, barely scraping by, when she'd gotten sick, missed work, lost both jobs in the same week. Without income, she couldn't pay rent. Without rent, she ended up here. She was trying to get her GED, she'd told Eleanor, studying in the shelter's tiny library whenever she could grab a quiet moment, determined to build something better for Jasmine. But exhaustion was wearing her down, and Eleanor could see the hope fading from her eyes a little more each day. These women's stories haunted Eleanor, made her own situation feel simultaneously less dire and more terrifying. She had an expiration date on her suffering, a clear endpoint when the inheritance would be hers and she could rebuild. But Maria, Keisha, and Brianna had no such certainty, no guarantee that things would ever get better. They were trapped in a cycle that seemed designed to keep them down, every system they encountered placing new obstacles in their path. Want to get a job? You need an address, clean clothes, childcare. Can't afford those things without a job. Want housing assistance? There's a 2-year waiting list, and you need proof of income to qualify. Want to leave the shelter? You need first month's rent, last month's rent, a security deposit, and good credit. Impossible requirements for women who'd lost everything. Eleanor's case manager, a well-meaning young woman named Stephanie who couldn't have been more than 25, had been pushing her to file for divorce and seek child support from Blake. You're entitled to it, Stephanie had insisted during their meeting yesterday. He can't just throw you out with nothing. There are laws. But Eleanor had demurred, had made excuses about wanting to try reconciliation, about needing time to think. The truth was that she couldn't pursue legal action against Blake without potentially revealing the inheritance, without lawyers getting involved who might discover what she was supposed to be keeping secret. 24 more days. She just needed to survive 24 more days without tipping her hand. Stephanie had given her a disappointed look, clearly thinking Eleanor was one of those women who couldn't let go of an abusive relationship, who would inevitably return to the man who'd hurt her. Eleanor had let her think it. Better that than the truth. The nights were the worst. Rosemary had colic, screaming for hours every evening, no matter what Eleanor tried. The other mothers were understanding. They'd all been there. But Eleanor could feel the tension in the room, the frustration of women who desperately needed sleep being kept awake by a crying baby. She'd taken to walking the halls with Rosemary during the worst episodes, pacing the same stretch of corridor over and over until her feet ached and her arms trembled from holding the baby for so long. During those walks, she'd pass other women, some heading to the bathroom, others unable to sleep. A few sneaking out for cigarettes despite the rules. They'd nod to each other, members of an unwanted sisterhood, bound together by circumstances beyond their control. On one of those walks, Eleanor had run into Diana, the intake coordinator, who'd been working late on paperwork. They'd talked for a while, Diana sharing more of her own story. She'd been in an abusive relationship in her early 20s, had finally found the courage to leave after he'd put her in the hospital. She'd ended up in a shelter much like this one, pregnant and alone, terrified of the future. But she'd clawed her way out, gotten her degree in social work, dedicated her life to helping other women escape the same trap. The thing is, Diana had said, her eyes reflecting the fluorescent lights, society loves to talk about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, but they never acknowledge that some people don't have boots. Some people are standing in quicksand, and every movement they make just pulls them deeper. These shelters, they're supposed to be a safety net, but they're more like a holding pattern. We keep women alive, keep them from freezing to death on the streets, but we don't actually help them build a future. There's no funding for that, no political will. Eleanor thought about that conversation now as she watched the women around her in the cafeteria. Maria typing on her phone, probably sending out more job applications. Keisha trying to get her youngest to eat while the other two fought over a toy. Brianna staring at nothing, her face blank with exhaustion. How many of them would make it out? How many would be trapped in this cycle for months, years, forever? And what would Eleanor do with her inheritance once she could access it? The question had been nagging at her for days now. She couldn't just take the money and disappear, couldn't just save herself and forget about the women she'd met here. That would make her no better than Blake, no better than all the people who'd looked at her on the street and turned away, unwilling to see the humanity in homelessness. A commotion at the cafeteria entrance snapped Eleanor from her thoughts. A woman was arguing with one of the staff members, her voice rising to a shout. I just need one more week. I've got a job interview on Monday. A real one, not some fast food place. I can't go back to the streets now, not when I'm this close. The staff member, a heavyset man who always looked annoyed to be working there, shook his head. Rules are rules. 2 weeks maximum. Your time's up. You need to pack your things and be out by noon. The woman's face crumpled. Please, I'm begging you. Just a few more days. But the man was already turning away, done with the conversation, leaving the woman standing there with tears streaming down her face. Eleanor watched the scene with horror, understanding for the first time the true precariousness of her situation. She had less than 2 weeks left before she'd be that woman, begging for extensions, facing the streets again with a newborn baby. Except she wouldn't have to beg. In 24 days, she'd have access to more money than she could spend in 10 lifetimes. The absurdity of it struck her with physical force. She was homeless and a multi-billionaire at the same time, existing in both states simultaneously, unable to resolve the cognitive dissonance of her situation. Her grandfather must have been truly eccentric to devise such a test, or perhaps he'd been cruel, unable to imagine what it would actually mean to live in poverty while knowing wealth was just out of reach. Or maybe he'd known exactly what he was doing, had wanted her to understand viscerally what it meant to have nothing, to be at the mercy of systems and people who saw you as expendable. Maria slid into the seat across from Eleanor, Diego in tow. "You okay? You look a million miles away." Eleanor forced a smile. "Just thinking." Maria nodded knowingly. "Dangerous occupation in here. Too much thinking makes you crazy. You've got to stay focused on the next step, just the next step, or you'll drown in the enormity of it all." She pulled out her phone, showing Eleanor the screen. "Got a call back on a job application. Legal assistant position, pays half what I used to make, but it's something. Interviews tomorrow. Will you watch Diego during my morning workshop so I can leave early to prepare?" Eleanor agreed immediately. Maria had been kind to her, had shown her the ropes, had shared her formula when Eleanor's supply ran out. Helping with Diego was the least she could do. That night, lying in her narrow bed with Rosemary sleeping fitfully beside her, Eleanor made a decision. She would document everything. Every conversation, every indignity, every moment of this experience. When she finally had access to her inheritance, she would use it to change things, to create something that actually helped women like Maria and Keisha and Brianna, something that gave them not just a bed for the night, but a real pathway out of poverty. She didn't know what form that help would take yet, but she had 24 days to figure it out. 24 days to learn as much as she could, to understand the systems that trapped people, to identify the gaps and failures that left women falling through the cracks. Her grandfather's test was teaching her something valuable after all, just not what he probably intended. He'd wanted her to see who really cared about her. Instead, he was showing her who the world cared about and who it left behind. The television in the shelter's common room flickered with the evening news, the volume turned low so as not to disturb the children playing on the worn carpet. Eleanor sat in a corner chair with Rosemary sleeping against her shoulder, half watching the screen while mentally preparing for her second meeting with Stephanie tomorrow. Keisha sat nearby, trying to read a romance novel while simultaneously monitoring her 3 kids, her attention divided in that way mothers developed, able to track multiple moving targets while theoretically doing something else. The news anchor's voice droned on about stock market fluctuations and political scandals, the kind of content that seemed to exist in a different universe from the shelter's reality. Then a segment began that made Eleanor sit up straighter, nearly waking Rosemary with a sudden movement. Richardson Technologies announced today a major expansion of their downtown headquarters, a project expected to create hundreds of new jobs over the next 2 years. The screen showed footage of a press conference, and there was Blake, standing at a podium, looking confident and successful in an expensive suit Eleanor didn't recognize. He must have bought it recently, probably with Jessica's input, upgrading his image to match his rising status. "We're excited to be investing in this city's future," Blake said to the assembled reporters, his voice smooth and practiced. "Richardson Technologies has always been committed to innovation and growth, and this expansion represents our confidence in the market and our team's capabilities." The camera panned, and Eleanor's breath caught as she spotted Jessica standing just behind Blake, her hand resting possessively on his shoulder, her smile radiant. She was wearing a diamond necklace that caught the light, expensive and ostentatious. "That's her, isn't it?" Keisha's voice made Eleanor jump. She'd been so focused on the screen that she hadn't noticed Keisha move closer. "The friend who stole your husband?" Eleanor could only nod, her throat tight with anger and pain. Keisha's expression hardened. "She looks exactly like I imagined. One of those women who thinks the world owes her everything, who takes whatever she wants without thinking about who she's hurting." They watched as the news segment continued, showing architectural renderings of the new building, interviews with city officials praising the project, more footage of Blake and Jessica looking like the perfect power couple. Eleanor wanted to scream, wanted to throw something at the television, wanted to somehow reach through the screen and make them see her, make them understand what they'd done. The segment ended, moving on to weather forecasts, and Eleanor sat back in her chair, trembling with suppressed emotion. Blake was thriving. He'd thrown her out like garbage, and he was thriving, getting promotions and accolades, expanding his career while she was living in a homeless shelter, trying to figure out how to afford diapers. The injustice of it burned in her chest like acid. She thought of the woman who'd been kicked out of the shelter today, the one whose 2 weeks had expired. Where was she now? Sleeping in a doorway somewhere, or maybe she'd found a spot in another shelter if she was lucky. That woman's suffering meant nothing to people like Blake, was invisible to them, as invisible as Eleanor herself had become the moment she could no longer serve his purposes. I used to watch the news every night, Keisha said quietly, her eyes still on the television even though the segment had moved on. Back when I lived in a real house, had a real life, I'd watch it and think about all those rich people. Wonder what it was like to have their problems, their concerns about stock markets and business deals. I thought money insulated you from suffering, that if you just had enough of it, life would be easy. But being here, talking to women from all different backgrounds, I've learned that money doesn't prevent suffering. It just changes what you suffer about. That woman on the screen, your friend, she's suffering too. Maybe she doesn't know it yet. Maybe she thinks she's happy. But you can't build happiness on someone else's pain. It's unstable ground. Eventually it collapses. Eleanor wanted to believe that. Wanted to think that karma or justice or something would catch up with Blake and Jessica, would make them pay for what they'd done. But she'd seen too much in the past week to believe in cosmic justice. The world didn't work that way. Bad people often prospered. Good people often suffered. The universe was fundamentally indifferent to human concepts of fairness. If she wanted justice, she'd have to create it herself. The thought was both terrifying and empowering. In 23 days, she would have the resources to do exactly that. The question was what form that justice would take. She wasn't interested in petty revenge, in making Blake and Jessica suffer for its own sake. That would be satisfying in the moment, but empty in the long run. No, she wanted something bigger. Something that would not only address what they'd done to her, but would also create lasting change for women in situations like hers. An idea began to form in her mind, vague and incomplete, but growing stronger with each passing moment. Richardson Technologies was planning an expansion. That expansion would require permits, city approval, community support. What if that support wasn't forthcoming? What if the company suddenly found itself facing obstacles, questions about its employment practices, its treatment of workers, its community impact? Eleanor had seen how Maria had been laid off without warning or severance. She'd heard Diana's story about automation eliminating jobs without any concern for the people being displaced. Blake's company probably had a long history of similar decisions, prioritizing profit over people, and that history could be brought to light. Not through Eleanor directly, she couldn't reveal herself yet, but through careful information gathering and strategic leaking to the right journalists or advocacy groups. But that was thinking small, focusing on Blake and his company when the real problem was so much larger. Eleanor looked around the common room at the women and children gathered there, at the peeling paint and broken furniture, at the television that was probably older than some of the kids watching it. This shelter was supposedly one of the better ones in the city, and it was still inadequate, still a band-aid on a gaping wound. The entire system needed to change, needed a complete overhaul of how society thought about and addressed homelessness, particularly for women and children. That kind of change required money, political will, and sustained effort. Eleanor would have the money. She'd have to figure out how to generate the political will and sustain the effort long enough to make a real difference. Maria emerged from the bedroom wing, Diego trailing behind her, both of them dressed in their best clothes. The job interview. Eleanor had almost forgotten. Maria looked nervous, her hands fidgeting with her purse strap. How do I look? Professional enough? She wore a navy blazer over a white blouse, Probably the same outfit she'd worn to work every day in her old life. Now slightly worn, but still respectable. Eleanor stood, shifting Rosemary to her other shoulder. You look perfect, confident, capable, exactly what they're looking for. Maria smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'm terrified. It's been 8 months since I had a real interview. What if I've forgotten how to do this? What if they can tell I'm living in a shelter? What if... Eleanor cut her off gently. You're going to be great. You're smart, experienced, and you want this. That comes through. They'd be lucky to have you. After Maria left, Eleanor found herself pacing the common room with Diego entertaining himself with a coloring book nearby, Rosemary still asleep. She thought about her own career, the one that had never materialized, the dreams of architecture she'd abandoned for Blake. What would her life look like now if she'd gone to MIT, if she'd pursued her degree, if she'd built her own career instead of subordinating everything to Blake's ambitions? She'd probably still be working at some firm, designing buildings, making her own money, having her own identity beyond being someone's wife. She'd have options, independence, the ability to leave at the first sign that the relationship was toxic. Instead, she'd made herself completely dependent, had believed Blake when he said that was what love looked like, that sacrifice and subordination were how you showed commitment. Never again. Eleanor made that promise to herself as she walked the length of the common room. Whatever happened after she claimed her inheritance, however her life unfolded from that point forward, she would never again put herself in a position where someone else controlled her economic security, her identity, her ability to survive. She would build something of her own, something that couldn't be taken away, something that would stand as proof that she existed independently of any relationship or other person's definition of her worth. And she would help other women do the same, would create pathways for them to achieve the kind of independence that had been denied to her and to so many others. The news cycle continued on the television, moving from weather to sports to entertainment. But Eleanor wasn't watching anymore. She was planning, calculating, imagining the future she would build once she had the resources to do so. 23 days. The number had become a mantra, a countdown to transformation. She just had to hold on for 23 more days. Then everything would change. Then the real work would begin. Maria returned to the shelter 3 hours later, her face unreadable as she walked through the common room toward the bedroom wing. Eleanor followed her, concern overriding the boundaries they'd all learned to maintain in the cramped quarters. She found Maria sitting on her bed, staring at her hands, her expression somewhere between shock and disbelief. Maria, what happened? How did it go? For a long moment, Maria didn't respond. Then she looked up, and Eleanor saw tears streaming down her face. But she was smiling, a wide, incredulous smile that transformed her features. I got it. They offered me the job right there in the interview. I start Monday. It's $40,000 a year, not what I used to make, but it's enough. It's enough to get out of here, to find an apartment, to give Diego a real home again. Eleanor felt tears spring to her own eyes, a rush of genuine happiness for Maria's good fortune. She sat down on the bed and hugged her roommate, feeling Maria shake with sobs of relief. I was so scared, Maria whispered, so scared that I'd be stuck here forever, that Diego would grow up thinking this was normal, that I'd never get back on my feet. But maybe we're going to be okay. Maybe we're actually going to be okay. Eleanor held her tighter, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. This was why she had to survive, why she had to claim her inheritance and use it properly, so that Maria's story could be replicated thousands of times over, so that women wouldn't have to rely on luck and timing and the mercy of a single employer, but would have systemic support that caught them when they fell and helped them rise again. The celebration was muted because celebrations in shelters always were, constrained by the knowledge that one person's joy highlighted everyone else's continuing struggle. But that evening, the women in room 217 pooled their meager resources to buy a small cake from the corner store, using it to toast Maria's success. Even Brianna, who'd been particularly despondent lately, managed a genuine smile, though Eleanor could see the worry in her eyes, the unspoken question of whether she'd ever get her own turn at good news. Keisha's kids were ecstatic about the cake, making the occasion feel almost festive despite the grim surroundings. For a few hours, the room felt less like a way station for the desperate and more like a community of people supporting each other through hard times. Later that night, after lights out, Eleanor lay awake thinking about luck and systemic change. Maria had gotten lucky. The right job listing at the right time, the right interviewer who saw her potential, the right combination of factors that aligned to create an opportunity. But luck was a terrible social policy. Luck meant that for every Maria who found a way out, there were dozens of Keishas and Briannas who didn't, who remained trapped not because they lacked ability or determination, but because the right opportunity never materialized. A just society couldn't rely on luck. It needed structures and systems that created pathways out of poverty for everyone who wanted to work their way out. Not just the fortunate few who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Eleanor's inheritance would allow her to create some of those structures, but she was realistic about the limitations. One person's fortune, even $1 billion fortune, couldn't fix everything, couldn't address every systemic failure and inequality. She'd need allies, would need to work within existing systems while also pushing for fundamental changes. That would require patience, strategy, and a willingness to play the long game. It would also require her to become someone different from who she'd been before, to develop skills and knowledge she didn't currently possess. The Eleanor who'd been thrown out into the snow 2 weeks ago could never have pulled that off. But maybe the Eleanor who was being forged in this shelter, who was learning about resilience and systemic injustice and the desperate courage of women fighting to survive, maybe that Eleanor could. 22 days. The countdown continued, each day both interminable and flying past. Eleanor was learning to exist in the strange liminal space between her two identities, the homeless mother and the secret billionaire. Sometimes she forgot about the inheritance entirely, lost in the immediate concerns of surviving another day, making sure Rosemary stayed healthy, attending the mandatory workshops, navigating the shelter's social dynamics. Other times, the knowledge of what awaited her felt like a secret fire burning in her chest, impossible to contain, threatening to burst out at any moment. She wanted to tell Maria, wanted to promise Brianna that everything would be okay, wanted to fund a complete renovation of the shelter and increases in the staff's salaries and better food and resources for everyone. But she couldn't, not yet. She had to wait, had to honor the terms of her grandfather's test, even though she now understood its cruelty alongside its purpose. Rosemary stirred in her sleep, making the small sounds that meant she'd wake soon, demanding food. Eleanor prepared a bottle in the dark, not wanting to disturb her roommates, and carried her daughter to the common room to feed her. The night staff member, an older woman named Gloria, who'd always been kind to Eleanor, nodded in greeting. They'd developed a routine over the past week, these quiet conversations in the middle of the night when the shelter was as peaceful as it ever got. Gloria had worked at various shelters for 30 years, had seen thousands of women pass through, some successfully transitioning back to stable housing, many disappearing into the streets or the void of extreme poverty. "You're different from most of them," Gloria had told Eleanor a few nights ago. "You've got something in you, some kind of core strength that's going to carry you through this. I can always tell which ones are going to make it." Eleanor had wanted to tell her the truth, wanted to explain that her apparent strength came from knowing this was temporary, that she had an end date for her suffering. But she'd stayed silent, accepting the compliment while feeling like a fraud. The women who survived this without $1 billion safety net, they were the ones with real strength. Eleanor was just play acting, cosplaying poverty with an expiration date. The guilt of that realization sat heavy in her stomach. She was deceiving everyone here, letting them believe she was one of them when she was fundamentally different, fundamentally protected in ways they would never be. When she finally revealed who she really was, would they feel betrayed? Would they think she'd been slumming, using their pain as some kind of social experiment? The question troubled her as she fed Rosemary, watching her daughter's face in the dim light of the common room. What would she tell Rosemary about this time when she was old enough to understand? How would she explain that her father had thrown them both away, that they'd lived in a shelter for weeks, that her mother had been simultaneously powerless and possessed of unimaginable power? Eleanor wanted to believe that this experience would make Rosemary more empathetic, more aware of how precarious life could be for so many people. But she also worried about the trauma of these early weeks, about whether being thrown out into the snow at 3 weeks old would leave some indelible mark on her daughter's psyche. Science suggested that infants couldn't form conscious memories of events, but Eleanor wondered if the body remembered, if stress and fear could imprint themselves on a developing nervous system in ways that would surface later in life. She pushed the dark thoughts away, focusing instead on the practical question of what came after. Maria was leaving the shelter in a week, had already found an apartment she could afford with her new salary, a studio in a neighborhood that wasn't great but wasn't terrible, a place where she and Diego could start rebuilding their lives. Eleanor was happy for her, but also worried about her own situation. With Maria gone, she'd lose her strongest ally in the shelter, the person who'd helped her navigate this world and had shown her genuine friendship. Keisha was kind but overwhelmed with her own children. Brianna was too young and too exhausted to be reliable support. Eleanor would be more alone than ever during these final weeks before she could claim her inheritance. The prospect filled her with anxiety, but also a strange anticipation. Maybe she needed to be alone, needed to strip away all support and see if she could survive completely on her own merits. Maybe that was the final lesson her grandfather's test had to teach her. Rosemary finished her bottle and fell back asleep, her tiny body relaxed and trusting against Eleanor's chest. Eleanor held her close, breathing in that distinctive baby smell, feeling the weight and warmth of her daughter. Whatever else happened, whatever challenges lay ahead, she had Rosemary. She had this small, perfect person who depended on her completely, who believed with absolute faith that her mother would keep her safe and fed and loved. Eleanor would not fail her. She would survive these 22 days, claim her inheritance, and build a life where Rosemary would grow up knowing her own worth, knowing that she was wanted and valued, knowing that her mother was strong enough to protect her from anything. And maybe, just maybe, Eleanor would find a way to extend that protection to all the other mothers and children who deserved it just as much. The lawyer's office looked exactly as Eleanor remembered it, all dark wood paneling and leather furniture, the kind of calculated sophistication that screamed old money and established power. Martin Pemberton sat behind his massive desk, his fingers still steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic pose, his blue eyes so like her grandfather's, assessing her with the same calculating intelligence. Eleanor held Rosemary against her shoulder, very aware of how she must look after 4 weeks in the shelter. Her clothes were clean but worn, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face free of makeup because she'd long since run out and couldn't afford to replace it. She looked nothing like the well-groomed woman who'd sat in this office a month ago, and she could see Pemberton noting every detail of her transformation. 30 days, Pemberton said, his voice neutral. The required period has elapsed. The trust is ready to be transferred into your full control. He pushed a thick folder across the desk toward her. These are the documents you'll need to sign. Once executed, you'll have complete access to all assets, properties, the Soren accounts. The total value has actually increased since our last meeting due to market performance. Current estimates put your net worth at approximately $1.3 billion. He paused, watching her reaction. Eleanor felt nothing. The number was so abstract, so disconnected from her current reality of counting pennies and rationing diapers, that it might as well have been monopoly money. Before we proceed, Pemberton continued, I'm required to ask if you've maintained the confidentiality your grandfather stipulated. Have you told anyone about the inheritance? Eleanor shook her head. No one. It had been the hardest promise to keep, especially during the darkest moments in the shelter, but she'd honored it. Pemberton nodded, something like approval flickering across his face. Then you've successfully completed the test. Your grandfather would be pleased, I think. He leaned back in his chair. He was a difficult man, as I'm sure you gathered from the limited interactions you had with him. Brilliant in business, utterly ruthless with anyone who tried to take advantage of him. But he had his own code of honor. When your mother cut ties with him, a decision he respected even though it pained him, he kept track of you from a distance. He knew about your acceptance to MIT, Knew when you got married, knew when you became pregnant. He knew your husband, knew what kind of man he was. Eleanor sat up straighter. What do you mean? Pemberton's expression remained neutral, but she caught something in his eyes, a hint of satisfaction. Your grandfather made it his business to know everything about the people connected to his family. He had Blake Richardson investigated when you started dating him, again when you got engaged, and periodically throughout your marriage. The reports were not flattering. Blake was identified as someone who sought status and power above all else, who viewed relationships transactionally, who would discard you the moment you ceased to be useful to his ambitions. Pemberton pulled another folder from a drawer. Your grandfather predicted, with disturbing accuracy, what would happen. His will was written 2 years ago, and the 30-day confidentiality clause was specifically designed to create the conditions for Blake to reveal his true nature. The implications hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Her grandfather had known. He'd known that Blake would throw her out, had engineered circumstances that would make it happen, had essentially orchestrated the worst month of her life as a test. She felt anger rising in her chest, hot and choking. He let this happen? He knew I'd end up homeless with a newborn, and he let it happen. Pemberton's expression softened slightly. He believed you needed to see the truth. His own daughter, your mother, had married an abusive man against his advice, had suffered for years before finally leaving and cutting off contact with her family. Your grandfather blamed himself for not doing more to show her who her husband really was before the marriage. With you, he was trying a different approach. He wanted you to see Blake's true character in a way that was undeniable, impossible to rationalize or explain away. And he wanted you to prove to yourself that you could survive, that you were stronger than you believed. Eleanor wanted to throw something, wanted to rage at this dead man who'd manipulated her life like she was a piece on a chessboard. But underneath the anger was a reluctant understanding. If her grandfather had simply left her the money with no conditions, she would have stayed with Blake, would have used the wealth to try to save a marriage that was already poisoned. Blake and Jessica would have found a way to get their hands on the fortune, would have manipulated her into giving them access, and she would have ended up trapped in an even more toxic situation, unable to see the truth because the money would have complicated everything. The 30-day test had stripped away all the pretense, all the comfortable lies, and shown her reality in its starkest form. She hated her grandfather for it, but she also had to admit it had worked. What happened to my mother? Eleanor asked. She'd never known the full story, just fragments her mother had shared before she died. Pemberton hesitated, then seemed to decide she deserved the truth. Your mother met your father when she was 19. He was charming, attentive, everything she thought she wanted. Your grandfather saw through him immediately, saw a man who was attracted to the family money and prestige, who was looking for a meal ticket. He tried to warn your mother, but she was in love and thought he was being controlling and unreasonable. She married your father against your grandfather's wishes. For the first few years, your father was on his best behavior, but once you were born, his true nature emerged. He became controlling, emotionally abusive, financially manipulative. He never worked, lived off your mother's trust fund, and when she finally tried to leave him, he threatened to take you away from her. Eleanor felt tears burning in her eyes. Her mother had never told her any of this, had protected her from the worst of it. Your mother did leave eventually when you were 5. She divorced your father, gave up her trust fund as part of the settlement to keep full custody of you, and cut ties with your grandfather because she blamed him for not doing more to help her when she was trapped. Your grandfather tried to reach out over the years, tried to reconcile, but she refused all contact. She died believing he'd abandoned her when she needed him most. The truth was more complicated. He tried to help, but his methods were heavy-handed and controlling, and they'd only made the situation worse. He learned from that mistake. With you, he took a different approach. The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture Eleanor didn't want to see but couldn't deny. Her grandfather had been trying to save her from repeating her mother's mistakes, had been trying to give her the tools and knowledge to escape before she became as trapped as her mother had been. The method was cruel, but the intention was protective. She didn't have to forgive him for it, but she could understand it. What else did his investigation of Blake reveal? Eleanor asked. Pemberton opened the folder, scanning the contents. Quite a bit. Blake has been having an affair with Jessica Harper for 18 months, not the year they told you. The affair began shortly after you announced your pregnancy. He's been systematically moving money out of joint accounts into accounts in only his name, preparation for the divorce he'd been planning. He's also been positioning himself at Richardson Technologies for a promotion that would have been yours to influence if you'd revealed your inheritance, since you own controlling interest in the company. Eleanor's breath caught. I own Richardson Technologies? Pemberton smiled, and it was not a kind expression. Among many other things, your grandfather's portfolio includes controlling shares in 43 companies, Richardson Technologies among them. Blake Richardson works for you, though he doesn't know it yet. Your grandfather found that particular irony too delicious to resist. The man who married you thinking you were his meal ticket, who threw you away when you no longer served his purposes, is actually your employee. He pushed a document across the desk. This is the current board composition and reporting structure. Blake reports to a senior vice president, who reports to the CEO, who reports to the board, where your grandfather's proxy vote has been maintaining the current leadership structure. As of today, that proxy vote is yours. You control the company's direction. The power of it was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Eleanor thought of Blake on television, announcing the expansion, looking so proud and successful. He had no idea how precarious his position actually was, how completely his fate was now in her hands. She could fire him with a word, could destroy his career, could make him feel the same powerlessness he'd inflicted on her. The temptation was strong, a dark desire for immediate revenge, but something held her back, some instinct that said direct revenge would be too simple, too clean. Blake needed to understand what he'd done, needed to learn the lesson her grandfather had wanted to teach him about character and consequences. I want complete documentation of everything, Eleanor said. Blake's affair, the financial manipulation, all of it. I want to know every move he and Jessica made over the past 18 months. Pemberton nodded, already pulling more files from his drawers. For the next 2 hours, he walked Eleanor through the full scope of her inheritance and Blake's betrayal. The picture that emerged was damning. Blake had been planning to divorce her before she announced her pregnancy, but the pregnancy had complicated his timeline. He decided to wait until after the birth, not out of any concern for her or the baby, but because he'd consulted with a lawyer who told him that divorcing a pregnant wife would make him look bad in proceedings and could affect property settlements. Jessica had been in on the plan from the beginning, had been playing the role of supportive friend while actively working to destroy Eleanor's marriage. They'd been careful, covering their tracks, but not careful enough to evade the investigation Eleanor's grandfather had commissioned. What about the penthouse? Eleanor asked. Blake threw me out, but whose name is it in? Pemberton checked another document. The building is owned by one of your grandfather's holding companies. Blake's apartment is leased through Richardson Technologies as part of his compensation package. You own the building. You own the company. Therefore, you own the apartment Blake thinks is his. You could evict him today if you wanted to. The irony was perfect, almost too perfect. Eleanor had spent the past month in a homeless shelter while technically owning the building she'd been thrown out of. She'd been living in poverty while possessing a fortune. The absurdity of it made her want to laugh and cry simultaneously. Pemberton gave her time to process, refilling her water glass and allowing her to feed Rosemary while she absorbed the enormity of what she'd learned. Finally, he spoke again. You have decisions to make, Eleanor. What do you want to do about Blake? About the company? About your life going forward? I can file divorce papers today if you want. We can freeze his accounts, begin proceedings to recover the money he stole from you. We can have him fired, evicted, destroyed professionally and personally, or we can be more subtle, more strategic. It's your choice. Your grandfather left instructions that I was to help you with whatever you decided, but the decisions are entirely yours. Eleanor thought about Maria leaving the shelter next week, about Brianna still stuck there with no prospects, about Keisha trying to find housing that would accept her and 3 kids. She thought about Diana and Gloria and all the staff members who worked at the shelter for wages that barely covered their own expenses, driven by a desire to help rather than any financial incentive. She thought about the woman who'd been evicted from the shelter after 2 weeks, about all the other women she hadn't met who were living on the streets or in their cars or crammed into unsafe housing because they had no other options. And she thought about Blake, smug and successful, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse around him. "I want to buy the shelter," Eleanor said. "The building, the program, everything. I want to renovate it, expand it, pay the staff proper salaries, and create a real comprehensive program that helps women transition out of homelessness. I want to set up a fund that provides ongoing support, job training, childcare, whatever they need to actually rebuild their lives. And I want to do it anonymously, at least at first. I don't want anyone to know it's me." Pemberton made notes, nodding. "That can be arranged. What else?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "I want to fund similar programs across the city, across the country eventually. I want to create a network of support that catches women before they fall too far, that provides real systemic help instead of just temporary band-aids. And I want to do it in a way that changes how society thinks about homelessness and poverty, that challenges the narrative that people are poor because they're lazy or made bad choices." "An ambitious agenda," Pemberton said, "but certainly achievable with your resources." "And Blake?" Eleanor smiled, and she could feel that it wasn't a kind expression. "Blake gets to keep his job, his apartment, his life exactly as it is, for now. I want him to feel secure, to think he got away with it, to build his relationship with Jessica and his career at the company. And then, at the right moment, when he's most confident and comfortable, I want him to learn the truth about who I really am and who he's really been working for. I want him to understand that everything he has is because I've allowed him to have it, and that I can take it away whenever I choose. I want him to live with that knowledge, that fear, that understanding of how powerless he actually is. That's a more fitting punishment than simply destroying him outright." Pemberton's smile widened. "Your grandfather would approve. He always believed the best revenge was making someone live with the consequences of their choices, making them see their own mistakes reflected back at them." He pulled out the final stack of documents. "Then let's begin. Sign here and initial these pages. Your new life starts today, Ms. Morrison. Or should I say, Miss Morrison Thornton." Eleanor paused. "What?" Pemberton tapped the family tree diagram in one of the folders. "Your grandfather was Richard Thornton, founder of Thornton Holdings. You're his sole heir. The question is whether you want to publicly claim that name and everything it represents, or if you prefer to maintain a lower profile." Eleanor thought about it for a moment, then made her decision. "Eleanor Morrison Thornton. I want both names, my mother's and my grandfather's. A bridge between who I was and who I'm becoming." She picked up the pen and began to sign, each signature a step away from the woman Blake had thrown away and towards someone new, someone stronger, someone who understood both privilege and poverty, power and powerlessness, someone who would use that understanding to change things for the better. The last document signed, Pemberton gathered everything together and stood, extending his hand. "Welcome to your inheritance, Miss Morrison Thornton. I think you're going to do extraordinary things with it." Eleanor shook his hand, feeling the weight of possibility settling over her shoulders. In her arms, Rosemary stirred and opened her eyes, looking up at her mother with that unfocused newborn gaze that still seemed to see everything that mattered. Eleanor smiled down at her daughter. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. "More than okay. We're going to change the world." And for the first time in 30 days, she believed it completely. The woman who'd walked through snow with nowhere to go was gone, transformed by fire and hardship into someone who couldn't be broken because she'd already survived the worst and come through stronger on the other side. Blake had thrown her away thinking she was worthless. He was about to discover exactly how wrong he'd been, and that discovery would haunt him for the rest of his life. But that was for later. Right now, Eleanor had work to do. She had a shelter to transform, women to help, a daughter to raise, and a future to build. She walked out of Pemberton's office into the afternoon sunlight, feeling it warm on her face, and took the first step into her new life. The penthouse's floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, the same view Eleanor had looked out on the night Blake threw her out. But now she stood on the other side of those windows. In the hallway outside the apartment she'd once called home, her hand raised to knock on the door. It had been 3 months since that terrible night, 3 months since she'd walked through snow with Rosemary in her arms and nowhere to go. 3 months since she'd claimed her inheritance and begun the work of transformation, both of herself and the systems she'd witnessed failing so many women. The shelter renovation was nearly complete, a state-of-the-art facility that would reopen next month with comprehensive services and a staff paid professional wages. She'd funded similar projects in 6 other cities, with plans for 20 more by year's end. She'd created a foundation, established scholarship programs, hired consultants and experts to help her direct her resources where they'd do the most good, and she'd waited. Waited for Blake and Jessica to grow comfortable in their life together, to convince themselves they'd escape consequences for their betrayal. Waited until the expansion project at Richardson Technologies was nearly complete, until Blake had been promoted to senior vice president based on the success of that project, until he felt secure and proud of his accomplishments. Waited until Jessica had moved into the penthouse, had redecorated it to her taste, had thrown parties where she showed off her successful boyfriend and their enviable lifestyle. Waited until they'd both forgotten that Eleanor existed, had dismissed her as a sad chapter in their past, someone who'd been too weak and dependent to survive without them. Now the wait was over. Eleanor knocked. Jessica opened the door, her face shifting from polite curiosity to shock to something like fear in rapid succession. She looked good, Eleanor noted dispassionately. The expensive lifestyle clearly agreed with her. Her hair was professionally styled, her clothes designer labels, her makeup flawless. She looked like someone who'd never worried about money, never slept on a subway station bench, never rationed formula for a hungry baby. Eleanor, Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. What are you doing here? Eleanor smiled and she knew it wasn't warm. Hello, Jessica. I'm here to see Blake. Is he home? She could hear movement inside the apartment, Blake's voice calling out. Who is it? Then he appeared behind Jessica, and Eleanor watched his face go through the same progression of emotions. Shock, confusion, and finally, something that looked like guilt before his expression hardened into defensive anger. You can't be here. This is harassment. I'll call security. He reached for his phone, but Eleanor raised a hand to stop him. Please do call security. I'd love to explain to them that I'm the building owner and you're the one who's been living here without my permission. Blake froze. What are you talking about? Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, the same kind of folder Pemberton had given her 3 months ago. I'm talking about the fact that this building is owned by Thornton Holdings, a subsidiary of the Thornton estate, of which I am the sole heir. I'm talking about the fact that Richardson Technologies, where you've been so proud of your recent promotion, is also controlled by Thornton Holdings. I'm talking about the fact that I own this apartment, your company, and essentially your entire life. Surprise! The color drained from Blake's face. Jessica grabbed his arm as if needing physical support. That's impossible. You had nothing. You were nobody. I checked your background, your family, everything. There was no money. Eleanor's smile widened. You checked my mother's side. You never thought to look at my father's side, the grandfather I'd met twice and who left me everything. Richard Thornton. You might have heard of him. He founded Thornton Holdings 60 years ago and built it into one of the largest private investment firms in the world. He died 4 months ago and left me his entire fortune, which was placed in trust for 30 days while I observed my life and saw who I was surrounded by. That 30 days started the day before you threw me out into the snow. Perfect timing, really. Blake was shaking his head, denial written across his features. No, that's not possible. You would have said something. You would have told me. Eleanor's expression hardened. Why would I? So you could pretend to care, could manipulate your way into controlling my inheritance? My grandfather was a smart man. He knew exactly what kind of person you were, and he designed a test to prove it to me beyond any doubt. You passed that test with flying colors. You showed me exactly who you are when you think someone is powerless. when you think there's nothing to gain from them. You threw your wife and newborn daughter out into the snow without a second thought. You deserve everything that's about to happen to you. Jessica found her voice, and it was shrill with panic. You can't do this. Blake worked hard for that promotion. He earned it. You can't just take it away because you're vindictive. Eleanor turned her attention to Jessica, and the former friend actually took a step backward. Vindictive would be destroying you both immediately. Vindictive would be filing criminal charges for the money Blake stole from our joint accounts. Vindictive would be making sure neither of you ever worked in this industry again. I'm not interested in vindictive. I'm interested in justice, and those are very different things. Blake gets to keep his job, at least for now. You both get to stay in this apartment through the end of your lease, but you're going to know every day that you have these things because I allow you to have them, that your security, your success, your comfortable life all exists at my discretion and can be revoked at any moment if you step out of line. Blake finally seemed to find his voice, and it came out as a desperate plea. Eleanor, please. I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt you, but we can work this out. We can talk about this reasonably. Eleanor laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound. Like we talked reasonably when you threw me out? Like we talked reasonably when you told me I was worthless and parasitic? I'm not here to negotiate, Blake. I'm here to inform you of how things are going to be from now on. You're going to keep working at Richardson Technologies. You're going to do your job well and professionally. And you're going to live every day knowing that the company you're so proud to work for is mine, that the success you've built is happening on my foundation, with my resources under my control. Maybe that will teach you some humility. Maybe it will teach you that people have value beyond what they can do for you. She turned back to Jessica. As for you, you're going to think very carefully about the choices you've made, about what it means to betray someone who trusted you, who considered you a friend, who loved you like a sister. You're going to live with that betrayal, and you're going to ask yourself every day if whatever you got from Blake was worth it. Was it worth destroying a friendship? Was it worth participating in throwing a woman and a baby out into the snow? Was it worth becoming the kind of person who could do that without remorse? Jessica's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry. Elle, I'm so sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. Blake and I, Eleanor cut her off with a sharp gesture. Don't insult me with apologies now. If you were sorry, you would have been sorry then. You would have told me about the affair. You would have helped me instead of conspiring to destroy me. You're only sorry now because I have power and you're afraid of what I'll do with it. She pulled out another document from her folder. This is a divorce filing. Blake, you're going to sign it immediately, and you're going to agree to my terms without contest. I'm taking full custody of Rosemary, though you'll have supervised visitation rights if you choose to exercise them. I'm keeping everything that was mine before the marriage, and you're returning the money you stole from our joint accounts plus interest. In exchange, I won't pursue criminal charges for theft and won't make your professional life any more difficult than it needs to be. You get to keep your career and your life. All you lose is me and any claim to our daughter beyond basic parenting time. Given what you were willing to throw away 3 months ago, that should be an acceptable trade. Blake took the papers with shaking hands. Eleanor could see him trying to calculate, trying to figure out if there was any angle he could work, any way to negotiate better terms. But she'd learned from the best, had spent 3 months with Pemberton and the other lawyers and advisors who'd served her grandfather, had learned how to anticipate every move and counter it before it could be made. The divorce agreement was airtight. Blake had no leverage, no options, no way out except to sign. You've got 24 hours, Eleanor said. After that, I start making phone calls. There are several journalists who would love to hear about the Richardson Technologies senior VP who threw his wife and newborn out into the snow. I've got documentation, witnesses, everything I need to make it a national story. Your career wouldn't survive that kind of publicity. Blake's hand tightened on the papers until they crumpled. I could fight you. I could tell people you're trying to frame me, that you're lying about all of this. Eleanor shook her head. You could try, but I have resources you can't imagine, and I've spent 3 months documenting every aspect of your betrayal, The affair with Jessica, the financial theft, the eviction. I've got security footage from this building showing me leaving with Rosemary that night, time-stamped and verified. I've got records from the shelter where I lived for a month. I've got testimony from dozens of people who witnessed my circumstances. You can't win this, Blake. The only question is whether you make it harder on yourself by trying. The fight went out of him, visible in the way his shoulders slumped and his eyes lost focus. Jessica stood beside him, tears streaming down her face, her perfect makeup running in dark streaks. Eleanor felt no satisfaction in their pain, only a hollow sense that justice was being served, that the scales were being balanced. "I'm not a monster," Eleanor said, her voice softer now. "I'm not going to destroy you for the sake of revenge, but I am going to hold you accountable for what you did. You're going to live with the consequences of your choices. You're going to remember, every time you come home to this apartment or go to work at that company, that none of it would exist without me, and that your cruelty didn't go unpunished. Maybe that will make you a better person. Maybe you'll learn something from this. I doubt it, but maybe." She reached into her bag one more time and pulled out a photograph, the only one she had from the night she'd been thrown out. A nurse at the shelter clinic had taken it the next morning, showing Eleanor and Rosemary huddled on that narrow bed, both of them looking exhausted and traumatized. Eleanor set it on the hall table. "This is what you did. This is who you are. Don't ever forget it." Then she turned and walked away, back down the hallway toward the elevator, not looking back even when she heard Jessica's sobs or Blake's anguished cry. She'd said what she needed to say. The rest was up to them. In the elevator, Eleanor pulled out her phone and called Pemberton. "It's done. They know. Proceed with the next phase." His voice was warm with approval. "Excellent. I'll have the press releases ready to go tomorrow, once the divorce papers are filed." The next phase. That was the announcement of Eleanor Morrison Thornton's emergence as the new head of Thornton Holdings, her plans for the company and its various subsidiaries, her philanthropic initiatives and social programs. It would make headlines, would establish her as a major player in the business world, would end any ability Blake and Jessica had to control the narrative about what had happened between them. But more importantly, it would signal to women everywhere who'd been in situations like Eleanor's that there was hope, that survival was possible, that you could lose everything and still rebuild stronger than before. She'd already arranged interviews with major publications, had prepared statements about her time in the shelter and what it had taught her, had positioned herself as someone who understood both privilege and poverty and was committed to using her resources to bridge that gap. The elevator reached the ground floor, and Eleanor walked through the lobby where she'd stumbled out into the snow 3 months ago. The doorman who'd watched her leave that night did a double take when he saw her now, clearly dressed expensively, clearly someone important. She nodded to him, a small acknowledgement, and walked out into the afternoon sunshine. Her car was waiting, a black town car with a driver she'd hired not because she needed the luxury, but because she'd learned during her month in the shelter that she needed to conserve her energy for the fights that mattered. The driver opened the door and Eleanor slid into the back seat where Rosemary waited in her car seat, being watched by Elena, the nanny Eleanor had hired 2 weeks ago. Rosemary was 4 months old now, healthy and thriving, with her mother's dark hair and her own bright spirit that suggested she'd grow up to be someone formidable. Eleanor stroked her daughter's cheek, feeling that familiar surge of fierce, protective love. "We're done here, baby girl. We don't ever have to come back to this place. We're going home." Home was a brownstone Eleanor had purchased in a neighborhood far from the one she'd shared with Blake. A beautiful 4-story building she was having renovated to her specifications. She'd designed it herself, finally using the architectural training she'd abandoned years ago, creating a space that was both elegant and functional, a home that would stand as proof that she'd survived and thrived. The renovation wouldn't be done for another month, but Eleanor had already started imagining what it would feel like to live there, to have a space that was entirely hers, that no one could take away. As the car pulled into traffic, Eleanor thought about the past 3 months, about Maria and Keisha and Brianna and all the other women she'd met in the shelter. She'd stayed in touch with them, had been there when Maria got her first paycheck from her new job, had helped Brianna enroll in a GED program that included childcare, had assisted Keisha in finding housing that would accept her and her children. She'd done it quietly, through the foundation rather than personally, not wanting them to know yet that she was the one helping. That revelation would come later, when the press announced her identity and her story became public. She hoped they'd understand why she'd kept it secret, hoped they'd see that she'd been processing her own trauma while simultaneously working to help them with theirs. The city passed by outside the car windows, the same city that had felt so hostile when she'd been wandering through it homeless, now seeming merely indifferent, a place that could be shaped and changed by someone with vision and resources. Eleanor had both now. She had a voice, a platform, and the financial backing to make real change. The work ahead was enormous, but she was ready for it. She'd been forged in fire, had learned what mattered and what was superficial, had seen the best and worst of human nature, and come through with her faith in humanity intact. That was her grandfather's final gift, she realized. Not the money, though, that was certainly useful, but the knowledge that she could survive anything, that she was strong enough to endure the worst and come through stronger on the other side. Her phone buzzed with a text from Diana, the intake coordinator who'd given her a bed that first morning. "Saw your name in the news about the foundation donations. I had a feeling you were more than you seemed. Thank you for remembering us." Eleanor smiled and typed back a response. "You saved my life that day. I'll never forget it. And this is just the beginning." More coming soon, because it was just the beginning. Eleanor had plans, big ambitious plans that would take years to implement, but would fundamentally change how society addressed poverty and homelessness. She was going to use her privilege and power to lift others up, to create systems that worked instead of systems that failed, to be the kind of person her mother would have been proud of and her grandfather had hoped she'd become. The car pulled up to the hotel where Eleanor had been living while her brownstone was being renovated. It was a nice hotel, comfortable but not ostentatious, a place that felt temporary in exactly the way she needed right now. She gathered Rosemary into her arms and walked through the lobby to the elevator, thinking about Blake and Jessica in the penthouse, probably still reeling from her visit, probably trying to figure out what to do next. Let them worry. Let them lie awake at night wondering when the other shoe would drop. They'd earned that anxiety. Eleanor had more important things to focus on. She had a daughter to raise, a company to run, a foundation to build, and a future to create. The past was settled. Blake would sign the divorce papers, would live with the consequences of his choices, would spend the rest of his life knowing he'd thrown away something precious because he couldn't see its value. That night, after Rosemary was asleep and Elena had retired to her own room, Eleanor sat by the window looking out at the city lights. She thought about the woman she'd been 4 months ago, the one who'd been so desperate for Blake's approval, so convinced that her worth was tied to his perception of her. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own strength, who'd learned it through the hardest possible lessons. She thought about her mother, wished she could tell her that she'd escaped the same trap, that she'd broken the cycle of dependence and abuse that had haunted their family. And she thought about her grandfather, the difficult man she'd barely known, who'd been cruel and kind in equal measure, who'd given her an inheritance that was so much more than money. "Thank you," she whispered to his memory. "I understand now. I understand what you were trying to teach me, and I promise I'll use it well. I'll be the granddaughter you hoped for, the woman Mom deserved to become, the mother Rosemary needs me to be. I'll take everything you left me and make it matter." The city sparkled below her, full of people struggling and surviving, building and breaking, loving and betraying. Eleanor was one of them now, not separate or above, but part of the messy, complicated reality of human life. She'd been to the bottom and climbed back up, and that journey had given her perspective nothing else could have provided. She was ready for whatever came next. Blake had thrown her away thinking she was worthless. He'd been wrong, so fundamentally wrong that she almost pitied him for his blindness. But pity was for people who learned from their mistakes, who grew from their failures. Blake would probably never change, would probably spend his life chasing status and power without ever understanding what actually mattered. That was his tragedy. Eleanor's triumph was that she'd learned, she'd grown, and she'd emerge from the fire transformed into someone who could make a real difference in the world. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. And Eleanor Morrison Thornton was ready to write the next chapter on her own terms.